aircrafts, 1900–1945. The Pioneers. History has left evidence of the continuous efforts of mankind to fly like a bird. But it was not until 1483 when one of the greatest minds of the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci, started to develop an interest in flying machines. After several years of study, he managed to discover air resistance, a principle which is the basis of modern aerodynamics. In 1600, Robert Hooke designed a flying vehicle of flapping wings which was unable to take off, while the courtesan Ayard ultimately failed in his efforts to fly in front of Louis XIV. It was in 1742 when the Marquis of Bacqueville tried to fly across the Seine River using a pair of artificial wings, jumping from the roof of his house, which left him severely injured after landing on a riverboat. "30 years later, Deforge built a flying machine made out of wicker and with a pair of beating wings, but he crashed onto the ground after having jumped from a tower. In 1783, the physic Pilatre de Rossier, working with the Montgolfier brothers, made the first successful flight on an air balloon. In 1804, Sir George Cayley developed the stable, motionless wing, located next to the engine, and which laid the foundations of flight. Henri Giffard flew the first motorized airship to transport a man in 1856, and on that same year, the Navy captain Jean-Marc Lebris invented the first glider to fly with a passenger. The era of experimentation and attempts came to an end when, in 1890, the Frenchman Clement Ader took off from the ground on a self-made device named Éolé. It was powered by an engine, and its wings resembled those of a bat, with which he managed to land on the point where he had taken off. 1896 was the year when pre-Wright brothers aeronautics reached its heyday. The French-born Octave Chanute, who lived in the United States, and the North American astronomer Samuel Langley, under the watchful eye of Graham Bell, had made several successful attempts to fly with self-made machines. In that same year, the German engineer Otto Lilienthal, who had been studying for a long time the air and its natural laws, was able to develop the first hang glider, with which he took flights of more than 300 meters. At last, human beings were able to fly like eagles. Aviation had been born. Aerostats, or in other words, hot air balloons and dirigibles, ascend due to the lift caused by the difference in pressure which exists between the air in the atmosphere and the gaseous element which is contained within the large balloon that gives the aerostat such a characteristic shape. Balloons do not enjoy the benefit of steering, and their movement through the atmosphere is bound to the wind direction. They have a basket or a hamper, which is usually made of wicker or fiber, and which is joined to the sail network through a set of adequately strong ropes. The basket accommodates the crew and the passengers, transporting also the navigation apparatus, the propane gas bottles, and the burners used to heat the air. At the beginning, aerostats employed hydrogen. As hydrogen is highly flammable, it is quite dangerous, so it was replaced by helium. Hot air from the burners can also be used, as its high temperature reduces its density and thus makes it lighter than the surrounding air, leading therefore to the lifting of the balloon. A normal balloon is made up by a large sail of hundreds of square meters made out of fireproof fabric, which, when inflated, provides the necessary thrust for the aerostat to ascend until it reaches the point of equilibrium between the lift force and its own weight. The aerostat then maintains a level flight until the stable conditions are broken. The use of the hot air balloon as a weapon has a long history. They were used in the 1846 war between Mexico and the United States. In 1861, during the American Civil War, they were used in observation missions for the artillery and for the movement of troops. The balloon has been used as an instrument for scientific investigation. The Stratobol, considered at the time of its invention as the biggest in the world, was built for a scientific project of the American Air Force and the National Geographic Society for the investigation of the higher strata of the atmosphere. To accomplish this feat, the balloon had a large quantity of research apparatus, such as cameras, a spectrograph, a radio transmitter, and even a set of Geiger meters to measure cosmic radiation. The lift force was achieved through several burners, which filled the balloon with helium. The hardest part was to fit the basket to the inflated balloon, but once this was done, the balloon rose majestically with its 2 passengers on board until it reached the highest altitude achieved by mankind up to that date, 8,500 feet. After an 8-hour flight, the Stratobol carried out a relatively fast descent to reach land as soon as possible and analyzed the precious data obtained on climatic variation, cosmic radiation, radio waves, and radio frequency. Airships, or dirigibles, usually have an elongated shape and contain helium gas, which makes them lighter than the air. As time passed, their size grew, and they had to be protected by a stronger airframe and a keel to maintain their stability. They are equipped with engines and propellers, with control command which allows them to move upwards and downwards, but also to the right and left, or to port and starboard if we use the marine terminology which is often employed. Airships were frequently used as war machines during World War I. The use of the airship as a means of transport for passengers experienced a great surge as they frequently crossed the Atlantic Ocean long before the airplane did so for the first time. But its use as a popular way of transport declined after several accidents, largely provoked by the use of hydrogen. The most serious disaster was that of the Hindenburg airship, the Titanic of the skies, when, in the early morning of the 6th of May, 1937, the huge flying luxury hotel reached New York, and in front of the astonished eyes of hundreds of people who had come to see it land, it was suddenly engulfed by flames and fell to the ground, killing all of its 35 passengers. On the 17th of December, 1903, in North Carolina, in the United States, a new era in aviation began, thanks to the flight of the Wright brothers, followers of all the achievements of the German Lilienthal, who they considered to be the best designer and flight pilot of motorless machines. They constructed a biplane which they named Flyer. It was equipped with a 12-horsepower, 4-cylinder engine to drive 2 propellers which spun on opposing directions. They put the machine on a wooden rail in order to reduce as much as possible the effort needed for a takeoff with such limits on mechanical power. The honor of carrying out the flight was given to Wilbur Wright, who won the toss of a coin. They turned on the engine and the machine started to move slowly, gaining speed until it managed to stabilize and take off for a short journey. Wilbur Wright's flights only reached 40 meters and lasted 12 seconds. Despite the fact that numerous spectators had witnessed the flight, the brothers tried to conceal this first attempt, which they considered a failure. Throughout that day, Wilbur and his brother Orville carried out several flights until they achieved a length of 250 meters in 59 seconds. France was not far behind in terms of building and development of the first machines. The French war minister was conscious of the military possibilities of the airplane, and they hurried to buy the Wright brother biplane. They had moved to Europe to try to sell their design, as in their own country they had not been very successful. One of the brothers visited Spain, where he showed off his abilities in the Cuatro Vientos airdrome, watched by King Alfonso XIII, who was very fond of aeronautics. The flyer of the Wright brothers was made out of fir and ash tree wood, and some parts out of iron. Its wings were covered with muslin fabric and bound together by iron filaments. The steering was managed by balancing the body of the pilot from side to side. Altitude was controlled by a lever. Onboard instruments included an anemometer, a chronometer, and a revolution meter. This airplane symbolized a huge change in the history of aviation, as its design comprised the necessary aerodynamic characteristics for flight. From this point onwards, numerous technical developments and engineering feats followed. It was a watershed in the history of aviation. One of the greatest admirers of the Wright brothers was the rich Brazilian Alberto Santos Dumont. An adventurer and athlete, he lived in Paris and was a genius of improvisation. In 1901, he had been able to fly around the Eiffel Tower with a self-made balloon to which he had incorporated an engine. But it was in 1906 when he built an amazing airplane, which he named 14 Bis. With a T shape, it was made out of fabric and bamboo and contained an engine of 24 horsepower. On the 23rd of October that year, he was able to rise and travel 220 meters in 21 seconds. On the 12th of November, Dumont, along with the future aviation celebrities Blériot and Voisin, participated in the aviation awards of the French Aero Club and were given the first prize. He published his designs so that the public could have access to them. He is considered as one of the greatest pioneers of aviation, and he was the first pilot to take off from his own efforts. On the 13th of January 1908, Henry Farman managed to fly near Paris his first kilometer at the command of a Voisin model airplane. At the other side of the Atlantic, the American Glenn Curtiss surpassed 1,500 meters on a biplane named Junebug. 6 years after the first flight of the Wright brothers, and following the significant achievements of Dumont and Henry Farman, the French pilot Louis Blériot constructed a monoplane named Blériot 11. With a wingspan of 10 meters and a length of nearly 8. It included a 3-cylinder engine with 80 horsepower and a flotation chamber as a precaution against possible ditching. On the 25th of July, 1909, Blériot accompanied the first crossing of the English Channel between Calais and Dover, traveling the 37 which separate the towns in little more than a half an hour at the incredible speed of 38 knots. Blériot had a rough journey, but managed to land in Dover, breaking the undercarriage which had 2 bicycle wheels amidst the wonder and ovation of the viewers. The importance of his achievement had strong political repercussions, as it proved that England was relatively accessible from the air. Louis Blériot was a pioneer in the utilization of the standard control system used by airplanes and which he patented in 1918. Engineers and technicians of different countries put great effort into achieving a greater effectiveness in the performance of the machines. In France, the Seguin brothers created a new engine, the rotational Gnome, which was used by Henry Farman in his model known as the Farman 3. This new airplane had incorporated a system of ailerons which allowed him to steer the machine to change direction, the predecessor of the modern steering system. Its maximum speed did not reach 38 knots. The pilot was seated in the open on the lower part of the airplane. This biplane became very popular at the time as it won several of the tests of the Great Week of Aviation of Reims in August 1909. That same year, the Italian Army officer Giulio Douhet warned of the danger the airplane could pose in warfare. 1910 was the year of aviation competitions all over the world, together with great feats such as those achieved by the Peruvian Jorge Chavez, who flew over the Alps, or the involvement of women in the challenges of aviation, epitomized by the French woman Raymonde de la Roche, the first female in history to get a pilot license. This year, the first attempts of developing jet propulsion started. Henri Coanda built a jet engine, which became the forerunner of the use of jets to create the power of thrust. Furthermore, the first endeavors began to transport passengers by Zeppelin in Germany and by airplane in France. The young William Boeing tried to make himself a name in Los Angeles, while the French pilot Paul Hahn performed flights for Army officers invited by aviation companies who tried to convince them of the great possibilities airplanes had as a weapon of attack and defense. Some of the greatest advocators of this idea were Lieutenant Paul Beck of the American Army, who carried out tests by throwing sacks full of sand over Los Angeles, and Glenn Curtis, who simulated the bombing of an old battleship. In April 1911, the Italian government had succumbed to the development of aeronautical engineering and formed the Italian Air Force after buying 4 Bristol box kites, known with the familiar name of kites. The box kites had 2 planes of the same wingspan, propelled by a 50-horsepower Gnome engine. Built out of wood and fabric and strengthened by iron tubes, it was the first model used to train English pilots in flying academies. In December that same year, the Flight Academy of the British Navy was established, following the steps of the Belgian Army, who had done so in March. In North America, the first developments took place in the creation of naval aviation. The factories of aeronautical material in France were the first to experiment with models, thinking about the military need the Army could have on national defense issues. The engineer Henri Fabre had created the first hydroplane in history, which he named Le Canard, managing to fly 500 meters. Edward Newport, in the city of Surensis, France, was finalizing the details of his model, Newport 4, in the workshops of his company, founded in 1910. He incorporated a very complex system of controls, which consisted of a lever to ascend and descend. The steering of the wings and changes in direction were made by triggering pedals. A variant of this model, the Newport 11, gained a great prestige. The German factory Albatros built several biplanes for the Army, which used them to train pilots. The quality of the planes and the skills of its designer soon became famous, and numerous records were broken, which proved that German aeronautics were not far behind that of the French. Dr. Huth, the owner of the Albatros factory, also participated successfully in the development of hydroplanes. From the 17th of September to the 3rd of November 1911, Calbraith Rogers made the first flight in a Wright plane from New York to Los Angeles, crossing the 5,000 kilometers which separate the coasts from east to west. During 1912, aviation became a professional sport. The American captain Albert Berry made the first parachute jump from a plane in St. Louis. The Blériot Experimental 2, better known as BE-2, was presented in August 1912 in the aerial competition at Larkhill, where it beat the altitude record, reaching 10,500 feet. The BE-2 was the first British airplane to get to France in the First World War, and which suffered the greatest number of casualties at the hands of the Fokker E-1. It was a slow plane with a limited capacity to maneuver, and had a blind spot on its lower part, which German pilots exploited to shoot them down easily. With a wingspan of a little more than 11 meters, it was equipped with a 70 horsepower Renault engine, and in its 2C version, had two 7mm machine guns. On the other hand, the unending challenge of altitude was again beaten with the Morane-Saulnier that reached 18,400 feet. In terms of speed, velocities of nearly 100 knots had been achieved. The obsession with aviation expanded throughout the world. Marc Pourpet traveled across the Far East in his airplane, whilst Durafour carried out the first flights in Latin America, and Garros connected Tunis with Rome. The year 1913 started with the appearance of new circuits between capitals. In Monaco, the first competition that focused exclusively on hydroplanes was created with the incentive of the Schneider Cup. At the same time, the Sopwith tabloid was presented, initially designed as a racing biplane, but due to its military potential and the interest of the Army in having a combat airplane, it was quickly utilized by the British Navy against submarines. The speed with which records were beaten shows the capacity of aeronautic builders and engineers to assume new challenges, as in the case of the Aliat Berdone Roe, who designed and produced the famous Avro 504 model, which started to fly in the month of July 1913. The following year, the Germans put into use the Aviatik B-1, a relatively slow reconnaissance airplane. The biplane had a Mercedes engine of 100 horsepower and had no weapons whatsoever. The first shooting down of an airplane in history was of an aircraft of this type, which fell under the fire of a French Voisin biplane. The French did not accept falling behind in aeronautic production, and they put into service the Caudron G3, a two-seater reconnaissance airplane built out of wood and fabric, which incorporated an undercarriage with 4 wheels. As with all of the airplanes of its time, it had no flaps and carried out changes in direction through the curving of its wings. When the First World War started, the airplane was not yet considered as a weapon for combat. At first, it was used in reconnaissance and photographical missions. France was the pioneer within European aviation, and it prepared its aeronautic industry, considered to be the most modern in the world, to face the conflict. The French Air Force, known as Aviation Militaire, was made up by 3 units with a total of 140 war airplanes, with more than 150 in reserve, of the Blériot, Nieuport, Farman, Breguet, and Voisin class. The French military had actively participated in the development of aviation in their country, having created in 1911 the first aerial competition, which served as a way to select the different models of aircraft which suited their needs. The French contributed throughout the conflict with the largest number of aircraft to their allies, creating formidable airplanes. In Britain, the Royal Flying Corps had 180 airplanes. 5 days after the start of the Great War, they sent 65 airplanes of the Blériot 11, Farman 20, and Avro 504 models. During the war, the British created a great aeronautic industry, which was capable of producing more than 50,000 aircrafts. Even if in 1908 the British military command thought that the use of airplanes in the army could frighten horses, they did not take much time to convince themselves of the usefulness of the aircraft as a war machine. As in France, the army participated in experiments and collaborated with designers in the development of airplanes with the very advanced aeronautic techniques such as the de Havilland, Bristol, and Sopwith, among others. When the conflict started, Germany had at its disposal an aviation which was more for sports and leisure than for combat. The Army used the airplane solely in reconnaissance and observation missions. The Imperial Aviation Corps had a total of 246 machines, mostly of the Taube, Albatros, and Aviatik models. In the same way as it occurred in Britain, the Germans created their aeronautic power during the war itself, building more than 45,000 airplanes throughout the conflict. The designers, which had won worldwide fame for the quality of their aircrafts, were Fokker and Junkers. Fighter planes were the focus of Germany's airplane production, and at times they demonstrated the German supremacy in combat aircraft. The French and British had pioneered the idea of using the airplane as a war machine, but technically they faced lots of difficulties. In order to drop bombs from the air without adequate space or equipment, it was necessary to throw the bombs by hand from the observer's seat. In the case of the machine guns on board, the problem was to avoid shooting at the propeller or the vital parts of the aircraft itself. This problem had been studied by the Frenchman Salinier and the German Scheider in 1913. Then, in 1915, Roland Garros was shot down in German territory next to his monoplane, which was closely examined by the Dutch designer Anthony Fokker. He improved the French design, synchronizing the shots of the machine gun with the movement of the propeller. He incorporated this design into one of his airplanes called Fokker E-1. The flight tests were a complete success and turned the plane onto the first aircraft to shoot in the direct line of vision of the pilot. This monoplane aircraft of medium wingspan, joined to the fuselage of the airplane through several bolts, had an iron structure and a totally movable tail. It used a rotational engine and a double-bladed propeller. The E-1 and its improved version, the E-3, had a great impact on the pilots and their command, forcing the French and British to counteract the capacity of the Fokker. During the summer of 1915, the French aviation industry responded with the Nieuport 11 biplane and the British with the FE-2B model. The appearance of the FE-2 served to confront the superiority of the Fokker, which up to that date was being borne by the Nieuport 11. This two-seater plane, with a 120 horsepower engine and a rear propeller, was armed with a Lewis machine gun on the frontal cockpit and a second with a telescopic assembly over the central part of the wing. It was slightly slower than the E-3 model of the Fokker, but it did provide great responsiveness. Furthermore, the British Air Force added the Sopwith 1.5 Strutter, the first really effective fighter plane to serve the British Army. The aircraft produced initially were sent to France to protect bombers, but eventually they themselves ended up acting as such. Under license, the French factories produced a total of 4,600 airplanes, which were mostly sent to Belgium and Russia. This model, along with the so-called Camel, were two of the most effective planes of the Great War. This British fighter airplane shot down more enemy aircrafts than any other during the conflict, as the model of the 17th series was a very powerful machine due to its rotational engine, which gave it its thrust. The power of its engine, along with the fact that it carried its weaponry, munitions, and fuel in a very small space, allowed it to carry out very complicated maneuvers during the combat. It had a minor disadvantage in the takeoff, as the pilot had to perform strong steers and work with the ailerons as the engine tended to change its direction. This difficulty was not insignificant, as due to this, more pilots died during their training than in the actual combat. It is believed that it was a Camel airplane that shot down von Richthofen, the famous German hero. The developments in aviation continued, driven by the needs of the war. Each new machine had bigger engines aimed at satisfying the needs of the armies and leading to the appearance of the first bombers. On the 27th of May, 1915, French Voisin bombers started a great attack on German factories of poisonous gas in Ludwigshafen. The answer of the German army was to take to the front its new Gotha bomber. Built with a fuselage of wood and iron covered with fabric, it transported a crew of 3 men, the pilot, bomber, and gunner, and was capable of loading up to 500 kilos in bombs. The Gotha model of bombers was the most important to be developed by the German High Command when the limitations of Zeppelins in the war became evident. It was one of the great bombers that proved the response capacity in the air of the Germans when it became the central protagonist of the aerial incursions which resulted in the bombing of the city of London during the spring of 1917 up to May 1918. The British responded by improving the training of their pilots and by putting great efforts into the design and construction of its new airplanes, like the Bristol fighter. A biplane with a wooden structure covered with fabric, it carried a crew of 2 men seated opposite to each other and well armed to have a better defense. Very responsive, it was one of the most successful fighter planes of the war, even if it had an unhappy beginning in the bloody April, when it had to face Baron von Richthofen. The tests with hydroplanes continued on both sides of the front. In Britain, the short 184 had been developed, which intervened in the Dardanelles battle with an outstanding performance. But the problem of autonomy kept stopping the hydroplanes from taking long journeys, except if they were refueled at sea. New ideas of making an aircraft take off from a ship kept recurring. Normally, all the attempts failed due to the fact that the space on board a ship was not enough to obtain the necessary acceleration to take off and the deceleration needed for landing. The investigators ended up designing a system of catapults aimed at achieving the necessary speed to take off, and a device called shoes was added to the hydroplanes in order to be lifted by cranes to the ship's deck after ditching near the ship. After numerous tests on platforms installed on the decks of the battleships, the biplane Sopwith became the first to land on these primitive aircraft carriers. In 1916, in the Battle of Verdun, aerial warfare started to attain its true dimension. The best-known Nieuport model of the First World War was undoubtedly the Nieuport 17, which entered the conflict in March 1916. The Nieuport 17, a monoplane, was one of the characteristic fighter planes of the First World War. It had been designed by Delage and served the British Commonwealth forces in France, Belgium, Italy, and Russia, and was used by numerous aviation aces at the time. It was propelled by a rotational engine of 110 horsepower and could reach 95 knots at a height of 6,500 feet. Its weaponry normally consisted of a fixed Vickers machine gun, even if some were provided with rockets to attack airships. Frederick Handley Page, a British engineer, faced great difficulties during the development of his machines due to the high number of accidents suffered, which had brought him into conflict with the British admiralship. However, he was given the task of building a large bomber plane to carry out the most devastating incursions on Germany. This was how the Handley Page 0100 was born. During the First World War, the German Albatross factories mainly produced fighter airplanes. The D-1, created in 1916, was a fighter biplane with a plywood fuselage, which could reach heights of 19,600 feet. The D-3, more modern, was used in numerous war operations, where it managed to rival the Fokker D-7, considered as the best fighter plane during the Great War. This aeroplane represents the last attempt of the Germans to keep their superiority in aerial warfare. Baron von Richthofen had put all his efforts in its design. It enjoyed an exceptional speed in ascension and was a very fast, responsive, and resilient plane. In April 1917, the German Gotha bombers, which had been gradually improved from 1915, started to attack England from their bases in Belgium. Their main objective was London, where they eventually caused more than 800 deaths. On this date, the British Army model Scout Experimental 5 came into use, better known as SE-5 single-seater. It had a 150 horsepower engine and was armed with a Vickers synchronized machine gun and a Lewis on its wings. Many pilots preferred the SE-5 rather than the Sopwith Camel, as it was very fast and had a great capacity for lift, which allowed it to successfully face the German fighter planes. The best-known pilots of the war, such as René Fonck, Nungesser, or the legendary Guynemer, held with pride the commands of the Spad 13, which had been the product of Louis Blériot's experience. This airplane entered the conflict in April 1917 and successfully helped to destroy German supremacy. The Spad 13 was endowed with 2 Vickers machine guns and possessed a great stability when it came to shooting. It was a robust machine with a great capacity to maneuver. In the Spanish army, they had the reputation of being dangerous due to their numerous accidents. Even if the United States did not enter the war until 3 years after it had started, in 1917, its military preparation for the conflict was already quite advanced, both in its land forces as in its navy. However, the same had not happened with their Air Force, an aspect which had been notoriously overlooked, to the point that when they joined the war, they only had 250 airplanes, which put them in the 14th place in the list of the major military air forces of the world. During the war, the American pilots always relied on Allied resources. An example of this was the French Lafayette Squadron, which was exclusively formed by pilots from the United States. When the Americans entered the First World War, they only had 132 fighter planes, and most of them were out of date. Therefore, they commissioned a colonel of the aviation section. It was not considered as an independent force from the Navy and land forces, and he was given the task of finding among the Allies a plane which could be built in the U.S. under permission. After considering several models, the de Havilland DH-4 was selected because it was simple to build and was apparently adaptable to mass production. It was renamed the Liberty plane. This was a single-engine biplane built entirely out of wood and fabric, which took a crew of 2 men in different cockpits separated by the fuel tank. This hampered communication between the crew members and posed a great danger if the fuel was hit by enemy fire. The first de Havilland DH-4 to be produced in the United States came to France in May 1918, nearly at the end of the war. Even if there were still 4 months to prove the capability of the airplane, which were held in high esteem as, out of the 6 medals of honor given in this war, 4 were awarded to pilots and observers who had flown the DH-4. It was considered as the best bomber of its generation, as its resilience, speed, and capacity to rise allowed it to avoid with ease the attacks of the enemy fighter planes. It was armed with a fixed machine gun and 2 movable ones, and could carry 200 kilograms in bombs. In August 1918, near the end of the campaign, it performed a military feat which had great repercussions when it managed to shoot down the L-70 Zeppelin, commanded by the Supreme Chief of German airships. Some of these de Havilland DH-4 planes intervened in the Spanish campaign in Morocco, and specifically in the takeover of Chaouen. Among the German aircraft which reached worldwide fame during the First World War, the most prominent one was the Fokker DR-1. The Fokker DR-1 triplane came as a response to the success of another triplane, the British Sopwith. The Fokker DR-1 was known to be one of the most evasive planes of the war, which was confirmed by the fact that of the 21 victories of the Red Baron in this war, 19 were achieved using this type of aircraft. The first plane of this model to appear on the Western Front at the beginning of 1917 really astonished the pilots with its responsiveness. The famous Red Baron, given this name due to the lively color of his plane, lost his life in one of these machines. Manfred von Richthofen, at the age of 24, was one of the greatest aces of the First World War. His squadron managed to shoot down 88 airplanes out of a total of 150 air battles won by the Germans throughout the war. The tactics he used during the combats were a total success. He received the highest military decorations, and after his death was much mythologized. There was widespread controversy when several different pilots claimed responsibility for shooting him down. He was buried on French territory with military honors under a wreath with the words, "To our brave and honorable enemy."